Picture this scene from just a few years ago. A young software engineer in San Francisco gets his morning coffee and checks his phone. Tesla stock is up another 12%. His coworker just bought a house in Oakland for $800,000 with a 3% down payment. Bitcoin hits 60,000 again. Everyone around him seems to be getting rich by simply existing in the right place at the right time. Meanwhile, his grandmother in Ohio calls to complain that her grocery bill doubled and she can't afford to drive anywhere because gas prices went insane. Welcome to the most spectacular economic circus act in modern history, where the same policies that made some people millionaires overnight also created the biggest cost of living crisis in 50 years. How exactly do you engineer an economy where assets explode in value while actual living becomes unaffordable for the majority of working people? If you enjoy watching me dissect financial disasters and economic absurdity, hit subscribe and stick around. Understanding how this mess was engineered is one of the few ways you can stop your own finances from becoming collateral damage. The official story you've heard 1,000 times goes something like this. The pandemic hit in early 2020 and everything went to hell. Supply chains broke, people got sick, businesses closed, unemployment spiked. So naturally, the Federal Reserve and governments around the world had to act fast to prevent another Great Depression. They cut interest rates to zero, printed money like it was going out of style, and kept the lights on until the economy could recover. It worked. Markets bounced back. Jobs returned. Crisis averted. The end. This narrative gets repeated by everyone from Jerome Powell to your uncle, who watches too much CNBC. It's comforting because it makes the whole thing sound like competent adults making tough but necessary decisions under extreme pressure. The story suggests that without these interventions, we would have faced economic collapse on a scale that makes 2008 look like a minor hiccup. Most people accept this version because it fits their mental model of how things should work. When there's an emergency, authorities step in with emergency measures. When the emergency ends, things go back to normal. Simple cause and effect. Clean and logical. But here's what this tidy narrative completely ignores. The people making these decisions weren't neutral technocrats weighing costs and benefits for society as a whole. They were individuals with specific backgrounds, specific incentives, and specific blind spots. Most of them spent their careers in finance, consulting, or academia. Most of them owned significant amounts of financial assets. Most of them lived in expensive coastal cities where asset price inflation feels like prosperity rather than a problem. More importantly, the official story treats the pandemic as if it was the cause of all our economic problems, rather than just the excuse for accelerating policies that were already in motion. The Federal Reserve had been suppressing interest rates and inflating asset bubbles for over a decade before anyone heard of COVID. The wealth gap was already obscene. Housing was already unaffordable in most major cities. The pandemic didn't create these conditions. It just gave policymakers permission to hit the turbo button on the same failed strategies they'd been using since the financial crisis. Now let's perform the autopsy on how this disaster was systematically constructed through a series of predictable policy choices that benefited a small group of asset owners at the expense of everyone else. The first wound was interest rate policy. In March 2020, the Federal Reserve cut rates to zero and promised to keep them there indefinitely. This wasn't just an emergency measure. This was a deliberate choice to make borrowing free for large institutions while making saving worthless for regular people. When you can borrow money at 0% interest, every asset becomes a speculation target. Real estate, stocks, bonds, commodities, crypto, art, collectibles, you name it. Suddenly it makes financial sense to borrow as much as possible and buy anything that might appreciate faster than inflation. Who benefits from this policy? Anyone who already owns assets or has access to cheap credit. Who gets hurt? Anyone trying to save money in a bank account, anyone trying to buy their first home, anyone on a fixed income, and anyone whose wages don't keep up with asset price inflation. The Federal Reserve essentially declared war on savers and wage earners while subsidizing speculators and leveraged investors. The second wound was quantitative easing on steroids. Between March 2020 and early 2022, the Federal Reserve created roughly $5 trillion out of thin air and used it to buy government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. $5 trillion. That's more than the entire GDP of Japan. This wasn't helicopter money dropped on ordinary people. This was wholesale money printing that went directly into the financial system where it inflated asset prices across the board. The mechanics of this are important to understand. When the Fed buys bonds from banks and investment funds, those institutions get cash that they need to deploy somewhere. But with interest rates at zero, traditional safe investments like treasury bills and savings accounts yield nothing. So all that newly created money flows into riskier assets like stocks and real estate. This creates artificial demand that drives prices higher regardless of underlying economic fundamentals. The third wound was fiscal stimulus that was poorly targeted and often counterproductive. The government handed out trillions in pandemic relief, but much of it went to the wrong people at the wrong time. The Paycheck Protection Program was supposed to help small businesses keep workers employed, but it ended up subsidizing large companies and franchises that would have survived anyway. Meanwhile, enhanced unemployment benefits created perverse incentives that kept people out of the workforce even as the economy reopened. Even worse, stimulus checks went to millions of people who never lost their jobs or faced financial hardship. Middle-class professionals working from home got government money, while essential workers risking their health got nothing extra. This poorly targeted spending helped fuel demand for goods and services at precisely the moment when supply chains were constrained, guaranteeing price increases. The fourth wound was regulatory forbearance that allowed financial institutions to take excessive risks without consequences. Banks were allowed to ignore capital requirements. Landlords got eviction moratoriums that let them defer losses while property values soared. Zombie companies that should have failed got access to credit markets through Federal Reserve programs. Instead of allowing creative destruction to clear out inefficient businesses and reset prices, policymakers propped up everything and everyone. The fifth wound was energy policy that restricted supply while demand was artificially stimulated. The Biden administration canceled pipeline projects, restricted drilling permits, and signaled hostility toward fossil fuel development just as the economy was reopening and people were driving more. Meanwhile, monetary and fiscal stimulus was boosting demand for everything, including energy. You don't need an economics degree to predict what happens when you restrict supply while inflating demand. The sixth wound was housing policy that treated real estate as a financial asset rather than shelter for human beings. Instead of allowing housing prices to decline during the economic disruption, policymakers did everything possible to keep them elevated. The Federal Reserve bought mortgage-backed securities. The government provided forbearance for delinquent borrowers. Local governments imposed eviction moratoriums. The result was a housing market completely disconnected from local wages and economic conditions. Each of these policy choices made perfect sense from the perspective of someone whose wealth is tied up in financial assets. If you own stocks, bonds, and real estate, you want interest rates low, money printing high, and asset prices supported at all costs. If you work in finance or government, these policies look like sensible crisis management. But if you're a normal person trying to build wealth through work and saving, These same policies are a systematic transfer of purchasing power from your labor to other people's assets. So what did this economic engineering project mean for regular people trying to navigate daily life? The answer depends on where you were positioned when the music started. If you were a young person in your 20s or 30s trying to buy your first home, you got completely destroyed. House prices in most American cities increased by 30 to 50% in just 2 years. A starter home that cost $300,000 in 2019 suddenly cost $450,000 in 2022. Meanwhile, wages for entry-level jobs increased by maybe 5% annually. The mathematical impossibility of home ownership for an entire generation was engineered through deliberate policy choices. If you were a renter, you faced the double whammy of soaring housing costs and general inflation. Landlords whose properties had appreciated dramatically started charging rents that reflected their new paper wealth rather than local economic conditions. A one-bedroom apartment that rented for $1,500 before the pandemic suddenly cost $2,200 afterward. And that's assuming you could find one available, since many landlords decided to sell into the overheated market rather than deal with tenants. If you were a small business owner, you discovered that your rent, labor costs, and input prices all increased faster than you could raise prices for your customers. The same policies that made commercial real estate more expensive also made everything else more expensive. Restaurant owners found themselves paying double for food ingredients while their lease payments increased, and they couldn't find workers willing to accept pre-pandemic wages. If you were a retiree living on fixed income or savings, you got robbed in broad daylight. Your bank account that might have earned 2 or 3% interest before 2020 suddenly earned a fraction of a percent, while your cost of living increased by 6 to 8% annually. The Federal Reserve's war on savers hit older Americans hardest, since they typically hold more of their wealth in cash and bonds rather than stocks and real estate. If you were a worker in a traditional job, you experienced the weird phenomenon of nominally higher wages that bought less stuff. Maybe you got a raise from $15 an hour to $17 an hour. But if your rent increased from $800 to $1,200 monthly, and your grocery bill went from $300 to $450 monthly, that raise was actually a pay cut in real purchasing power terms. But if you happened to be positioned correctly, the same policies made you fantastically wealthy without any additional work or value creation. If you owned a house in Austin or Boise that tripled in value. If you owned tech stocks that doubled or tripled. If you had access to cheap credit that let you buy assets with borrowed money. If you worked in finance or real estate or any industry connected to the asset inflation boom. The past few years were like winning the lottery, except the lottery was rigged in favor of people who were already financially comfortable. This created a bizarre social dynamic where people's economic experiences became completely disconnected from their actual productivity or contribution to society. A nurse or teacher or mechanic who provided essential services saw their standard of living decline. Meanwhile, someone who bought Bitcoin or meme stocks or happened to inherit a house in the right zip code became wealthy through pure luck and timing. The psychological effects of this engineered inequality were predictable. Young people became increasingly cynical about traditional advice like working hard and saving money. Why would you scrimp and save when the purchasing power of your savings gets destroyed by monetary policy? Why would you focus on building job skills when asset speculation pays better than productive work? Entire generations started viewing the economy as a rigged casino rather than a system that rewards effort and innovation. Older Americans who benefited from asset price inflation often developed a false sense of prosperity that blinded them to the struggles of younger people. If your house and 401k doubled in value, it's easy to assume the economy is doing great, and anyone complaining about affordability must be lazy or entitled. This generational wealth gap became a political and social fault line that's still widening. So where does all this leave us, and what should we expect going forward? There are several possible futures, and the path we take depends on political choices that haven't been made yet. The first possibility is the soft landing scenario where everything works out fine. In this version, inflation gradually comes down without causing a recession. Interest rates normalize without crashing asset prices. Workers get raises that keep up with living costs. Housing becomes affordable again through increased supply. The wealth gaps close naturally as the economy grows. This is what policymakers are hoping for and what financial media wants you to believe will happen. The second possibility is the Japan scenario, where we get permanent stagnation disguised as stability. In this version, interest rates stay low forever because raising them would crash the over-leveraged financial system. Economic growth remains sluggish because too much capital is tied up in unproductive asset speculation. Young people accept lower living standards as the new normal. The economy becomes a museum where nothing changes, but nothing improves either. Wealth inequality becomes permanent because the people who own assets never have to sell them. The third possibility is the reset scenario, where the contradictions become unsustainable and something breaks catastrophically. In this version, either inflation spirals out of control or the financial system collapses under the weight of its own leverage. Asset prices crash back to earth. Millions of people discover their paper wealth was an illusion. The political system responds with even more extreme interventions that make everything worse. This leads to genuine economic hardship for almost everyone, followed by a long period of rebuilding. The fourth possibility is the reform scenario, where policymakers actually learn from their mistakes and implement structural changes. In this version, interest rates are allowed to reflect real economic conditions rather than political preferences. Financial institutions are required to maintain genuine capital reserves. Housing policy focuses on affordability rather than protecting existing owners. Tax policy reduces rather than increases inequality. This would require admitting that the current system isn't working and replacing it with something better. None of these futures are predetermined, and all of them remain possible depending on what happens next. But regardless of which path we end up taking, there are some mental tools you can use to navigate whatever comes. First, always follow incentives and capital flows rather than speeches and promises. Politicians and central bankers will always tell you their policies are designed to help ordinary people, but their actual incentives are to protect existing power structures and asset prices. Watch what they do with money and credit rather than listening to what they say about their intentions. Second, understand that demographics, energy, and basic math always beat political slogans and wishful thinking. You can't print your way to prosperity. You can't borrow your way out of debt. You can't regulate your way around supply and demand. Reality always wins eventually, even if politicians can postpone the reckoning for years or decades. Third, always ask who pays and when, rather than accepting simple explanations about complex policies. Every government program, every monetary intervention, every regulatory change has winners and losers. The losers are often diffuse and delayed, while the winners are concentrated and immediate. This makes it easy to sell policies that benefit small groups at the expense of everyone else. Fourth, remember that systems optimized for short-term stability often create long-term fragility. When policymakers prevent all small failures and corrections, they typically guarantee a bigger failure later. The economy needs periodic resets to clear out bad investments and reset prices to sustainable levels. The most important thing to understand about the current moment is that we're living through a controlled experiment in whether democratic societies can maintain economic reality or whether short-term political pressures will always override long-term sustainability. The early results are not encouraging, but the experiment isn't over yet. The next few years will determine whether we get honest price discovery or more asset bubbles, whether young people can build wealth through productivity or only through speculation, and whether we can have an economy that works for people who actually do useful things rather than just people who own the right pieces of paper. If you want to see the next chapter of this economic circus without getting trampled by it, subscribe and turn on notifications. The people running this system are not done making bad decisions, and the least we can do is understand exactly how they're doing it before the next round of rescue hits your wallet.